Thank you everyone for being here. It is really great to see you all in person again. One of the most beneficial parts of this conference, in my humble opinion, is getting together, having those informal conversations about the state of business and the environment. And getting to be back in person allows for that conversation. So please grab a cup of coffee, find folks that you haven't seen in a while, and start off those conversations. We're really excited to have you all here today. And thanks to all of you who got up early and made it here at 8 a.m. I promise you will not regret it. This is always one of my favorite sessions of the conference, the Meet the Regulators session, where we get to hear from the agencies who regulate many of the businesses that are here today and hear what's on their minds, what's pressing for them. And I'm really excited for this conversation. So thanks to all of you for coming. We're going to kick it off by doing a bit of a retrospective of 2022 and talking to these folks about what went well, what are some of the things on their mind. So we're just going to dive right in. Bios are in your programs if you want to read about everyone. But we're just going to get started because we have so much to talk about. So Nancy, I want to start with you. Nancy Bennett is the Interim Deputy Director of Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Nancy, to start off, I want to hear from you. I've been very inspired by the World Cup recently. Don't know if anyone's watching, so let's do some icebreakers. I want to hear, if I could be an expert, I think I might be a pro soccer player. What would you want to be an expert in, if you could be an expert in anything?
Yes, okay, well, good morning, everybody. Good to be here. You know, I think for me, this is going to sound a little strange, but I would love to be an expert in sustainable agriculture and actually soil, and I've always secretly wanted to be a farmer, and so I feel like in my next life, I would like to come back. It's just like there's rich with possibilities. I care a lot about climate change, and I feel like that's this sort of untapped potential, so I'd like to be a soil scientist, I think.
I love that, and I think we probably have many in the audience. And I think this mic is off, so I'm going to use my old teacher voice. Nancy, could you talk a little bit about Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's year? What were some of the, here you go, what were some of the biggest accomplishments for the agency this year?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I would say, you know, during the pandemic, I guess I'm looking back even a little bit further, you know, we did not slow down at all. And in fact, we've actually increased sort of our responsibilities at DEQ coming from the legislature and coming from the governor. And so actually one of the most significant things that happened at DEQ is the establishment of our climate protection program. At the end of 2021, our commission adopted new rules that establish enforceable annual limits on greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels. And these annual limits are going to decline gradually toward two milestones. So one is a 50% reduction by 2035 and a 90% reduction by 2050. And here's a little bit of good news. I feel like there's always a lot of doom and gloom around climate, and we're never going to get there. But a recent analysis by the Oregon Global Warming Commission found that Oregon is on track for the first time toward achieving our GHG reduction targets. And that is really because of the adoption of two policies. One is DEQ's Climate Protection Program. The other is House Bill 2021, which is the 100% clean electricity bill. I know there's a climate track here, and I encourage you to go. I know our climate manager will be there to talk more in depth about DEQ's program. I think some of the utilities will be there, and I think it'll be really interesting to hear kind of how we're going to get there. But I would just say again, you know, during this sort of first year of implementation, we've been working with our regulated fossil fuel suppliers. We have 19 companies that have registered for the program, and we're working with them on compliance. But we're also implementing a lot of other complementary programs because, you know, this is sort of this umbrella policy. We're going to ensure that these emission reductions happen, but there's a lot we can do sort of along the way to make it more efficient, more affordable. And so we have been working to expand other complementary policies at DEQ, one being our Clean Fuels program. That's our low carbon fuel standard. We just expanded that recently in November. Our commission took action on that. We have our EV rebate program, which has been very successful in Oregon, and we're one of the top states in terms of EV rebate or EV sales. And we've also been working closely with our partners at the Department of Transportation around a medium and heavy duty electrification effort. We got some money in the legislature this past spring, and we're working on a charging pilot. So we're really trying to do a lot of different policies. So I think, for us, it's been exciting, and we're very committed toward this kind of climate goals and really trying to make it achievable in Oregon. So that's a bit of our look back.
Great, thanks, Nancy. Dan is joining us from Idaho. This is the first year we've had Idaho Department of Environmental Quality in person, so thanks, Dan, for making the trip. Dan is the Regional Administrator of Idaho Department of Environmental Quality's Coeur d'Alene office. Dan, question for you. We have a lot of new environmental staff in the audience. This conference is a great one where folks come to learn about some of the fundamentals of environmental management. What was your first job with your agency? And after that, talk to us about Idaho and what your successes in 2022 were.
Sure, so I'll start off, I'm gonna go back a little bit further because I think it's a little more interesting. I've been with DEQ 5 years, and I started managing our Superfund project office. But my first job in the environmental industry was as an intern with Graphics Environmental Engineering. And my job was to review, we had done a CCTV inspection of the entire wastewater collection system. And my job was to watch all of those videos and document all the defects that we found. So I spent a whole summer watching videos of sewers. It was really exciting.
Someone's got to do it.
We've had a really busy year in Idaho. We have been experiencing really rapid population growth, one of the fastest growing states in the nation by percentage of existing population. With that comes a lot of demand for clean drinking water, safe management of wastewater, and so that puts a lot of demand on the services we provide at DEQ. And we have really, I think, really been proud of our staff at DEQ in responding to those challenges. We've seen in some of our offices, we've doubled the number of drinking water and wastewater plans and specifications that are submitted to our agency for review. We've seen a 23% increase in new permit applications for air quality permits. So that's been another sector where we see, more people comes higher demand on protecting our environment. We've also been had a really fortunate position, I guess, of having a state surplus. We've done a good job managing our budget through the pandemic. And Governor Little developed an initiative, his Leading Idaho initiative, and with that did some investments in clean water infrastructure and cleaning up contaminated sites. So we saw some investments in cleaning up the Triumph mine, which is an abandoned mine that is under the state's control. To manage that, we have some water quality improvements we're doing there. We also had a significant investment in reducing phosphorus loading to Coeur d'Alene Lake, which is part of an ongoing effort for the state managing water quality in Coeur d'Alene Lake, and then also ongoing metals cleanup in the Coeur d'Alene Basin as part of the Superfund cleanup there. And then also started on some of the water and wastewater infrastructure work with state dollars, which turned out to be a really good kind of momentum builder for some of the federal funding that we're seeing coming in here in the upcoming fiscal year. So made a lot of strides in those areas and made a lot of progress. So that's been really good. I think otherwise I think the biggest accomplishment is being able to do that while still facing a 10% vacancy rate among our staff. So we've had a hard time filling positions to keep up with the population growth. So the existing people that are there are just working harder and getting a lot done. So that's been really positive.
Great, thanks, Dan. Laura Watson from the Washington State Department of Ecology. Laura, I want to hear from you what one of the best pieces of advice you've ever received is that's prepared you for the job you're in now. That's a tough one. I'm surprised her with that.
No, there are so many great pieces of advice that I've gotten over the course of my career, and so many wonderful mentors I've had that it's hard to pick one. But I would say specific to the position I'm in right now, one of the best pieces of advice I got was from a prior Department of Ecology director, and what he told me is budget is policy. And that is incredibly true. What we decide to spend our money on, what we decide to ask the legislature for, what funding we get, basically decides what policy priorities we're going to be implementing as an agency. So we have to be really thoughtful about what money we're asking for and what we spend it on. And that's just something that sort of day in and day out experience in the job. And then about 2/3 of our budget, so our budget in the last biennium was $2.8 billion, but about 2/3 of that is passed through. And so we're passing that through to local governments, to tribes, to community groups, and that also the amount of pass-through money that we're getting and what it's being dedicated to obviously just has a huge impact in the ground in terms of the environmental work that's happening on the ground.
That makes so much sense and is a good segue into my next question, which, speaking of budget, what did you all spend your money on in 2022 and what were some of your biggest successes?
Yeah, so climate, like Oregon, we got 3 new climate programs up and running or about to finalize the 3rd one. Our Cap and Invest program through the State Climate Commitment Act that passed in 2021, we finalized the rules. That will be up and running in January of 2023. We'll be holding our first auction to sell allowances in February of 2023, which is super exciting. Our clean fuel standard, we're finally joining the rest of the West Coast from BC through California. Now Washington will have a clean fuel standard as well, and that will be implemented also January of 2023. And then the zero emission vehicle standards that we are in the process of finalizing. And then we're also working on methane capture from landfills, a little bit of a different timeline, working on the rules for that right now, as well as phase out of HFCs or hydrofluorocarbons. So ton of work around climate and a lot of money associated with the climate work, right? So we'll start holding auctions next year. We're expected to, our estimates, although I get very nervous with the estimates because you don't know how much money you're going to get through the auctions until you've actually held the auctions. But we're estimating close to $500 million in the first year of auctions, and then all that money will go back to basically funding clean energy projects, to climate resiliency projects, particularly in overburdened communities, basically taking all that money that's raised through the auctions and putting it back into climate protection and greenhouse gas mitigation. So that's super exciting. And then another budget thing that I'll mention is the Hanford cleanup, the most expensive cleanup possibly in the world, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. And we have really stepped up our lobbying efforts with the federal government to try to see an increase to that funding. It is consistently underfunded by about $1 billion a year. And so we have increased our funding, and that's true, and that's not a partisan issue. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. The Hanford Fund Up, it's just such a huge price tag. It's just consistently underfunded. So we've really stepped up our lobbying efforts. We've taken, trips to DC. We've had support of Governor Inslee. We've had great support from our congressional delegation across the board, especially Senator Murray. We did get an increase to the president's budget last year of $191 million, which is great. We just have $800 million more to go to be able to get what we need and really to keep cleanup on track. And when I talk about cleanup on track, it means we would like to see Hanford cleaned up during this century. And so we really need to see numbers of about $3.75 billion a year to see Hanford cleaned up during this century. Otherwise, we're going to see the cleanup get pushed out into next century, and that just feels very unacceptable to those of us in Washington State. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Anthony Barber. Anthony is the director of the Oregon operations at EPA Region 10. Anthony, I want to know, how did you get your start in government? Oh, no.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
I think it is. How did I start in government? Well, I served in the Navy for 7 years. And after that, I was looking for the path I would take, and I had multiple paths. I wanted to be a chemical and environmental engineer. So I looked at that. I looked at and also qualified to be a high school social studies teacher and a paramedic. And so all those routes were open to me. I did an internship with EPA because, as we were talking about before the session this morning, I thought that the best thing I could do would be to learn how to combat the evil government regulators. And how better to do that than to learn from the inside for a little while, and then go to the private side to to be a consultant or a technical expert to be able to help people deal with the government. So I stayed. That's basically it. So yeah.
So now that you've stayed, I want to hear about what you're working on. What has EPA Region 10 been focused on in 2022? What were some of your successes?
So the region is part of the national picture, and so we do, echo and emphasize the things that are going on nationally. So some of the things you've heard already, some of the greenhouse gas emissions regulations and reductions, especially Laura mentioned hydrofluorocarbons. So that's one of the things that EPA has emphasized across the country in the last year, and PFAS regulations, and perhaps we'll get into later about designation as a hazardous substance for a couple of those compounds. Regionally, we've been doing a number of things. I've been involved quite a bit in recovery from the 2020 Western Oregon wildfires. We have some resilience projects that we're doing, and we mentioned climate resilience, and also disaster resilience is a big part of what EPA does. And there's a lot in that. We have a lot of funding we'll talk about, but we're advancing the Portland Harbor cleanup here. We have what did I list here? I listed a bunch of things to talk about, and now my mind is blank. So I really want to get into the bipartisan infrastructure law and some of the other funding we have, because EPA's budget is in a typical year about $9 billion, and the bipartisan infrastructure law bill, I'm just going to say bill now, in the first year alone gave EPA $14.1 billion to push through and spend and in grants and loans and contracts and direct implementation. And so, the first year alone, our budgets just from that is 1.5 times what we would normally get. And then you add on the money from the American Rescue Plan, you add on money from the Inflation Reduction Act. Our budget in 2022 has tripled, and we're dealing with that. There's $1.5 billion over 5 years for brownfields. We've got a lot of brownfield sites. I was at a site yesterday in Tigard here in town that's going from a blighted site to a new coffee roastery and an innovative coffee cocktail bar, which I'd never heard of before, but that's exciting. So in Tigard, if you ever, a year from now, you'll be able to go to the Ava Roasteria and have a coffee cocktail.
We all like espresso martinis, and there'll be some at the happy hour this afternoon.
Yeah, that's new to me. So I think we've been, regionally, we've been involved in, protecting Bristol Bay up in Alaska. And, so we just came out with a determination of restricting a lot of the sediment disposal in the bay from the Pebble Mine. That was just less than a week ago we came out with that determination. What else? Regionally, I think that's, kind of all I plan to talk about.
I want to do a speed round, thinking it's really great to hear about the successes. I want to know about the challenges. So in just a sentence, talk to me about what have been the challenges your agencies have faced in 2022, and we're going to start with you, Dan.
Yeah, for us, it's definitely finding enough people to fill positions. So kind of filling the talent pipeline with good employees. To keep up with the increased demand on our services, we need people, and as people retire and private sector is booming and people leave, getting those positions backfilled has been the biggest challenge for us.
And I think you're going to hear that from many of the regulated businesses here at this conference, and we'll be talking about that at one of the panels. Nancy, what about DEQ, ODEQ?
Yes, I was going to say actually very much of a similar story for us. We have a really changing workforce, lots of new people coming in, but also lots of people leaving because there's just so many great opportunities out there. So that's been probably our biggest challenge, really, is bringing in enough folks to fill all the positions that we need.
Laura, same challenge, different challenge?
We do have the same challenge, but I'm going to go in a different direction, and I'm going to just mention climate change impacts, in particular flooding and drought in Washington State. We're seeing the impacts get significantly greater. Nooksack flooding that happened last year, November of last year, is a good example of that. And we haven't really seen, back to budget, haven't really seen funding catch up with that. And we haven't not maybe fully seen the scope of what those impacts are going to be, but we're really focused on trying to address those impacts because they're just going to get worse into the future.
Absolutely. Anthony.
Yeah, I would continue the theme with proper staffing, but the twist I put on it is with all that extra money, particularly a certain subset of our staffing, which is our grants managers, our accountants, that realm has been particularly challenging across the country in Region 10 and elsewhere.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you. It sounds like a real theme emerging from the challenges you all face. Even though you're all feeling the staffing challenges, I imagine that you are gearing up to do a lot in 2023. I would like to hear what are each agency's priorities. We're going to get really into the meat of some of the issues, but I want just high level what's on the docket. So let's start with you, Nancy.
Sure. I would say sort of first and foremost, Oregon really is in a state of transition right now. We just elected a new governor. She'll take office January 9th. We have many new legislators. We have new legislative leadership. And DEQ in Oregon is also in this state of transition. Our former director retired at the end of September. And we're sort of in the process of recruiting a new director. And unlike other state agencies, this is actually a commission-appointed position. So our commission is sort of hard at work on recruiting candidates for that. And we expect to name a new director probably by February. And just to share a few of the attributes that our commission is really looking for. One, we're really looking for someone with strong executive management skills. We have more than 800 employees. We have offices throughout the state. We have a really complex regulatory environment. So really want somebody with that sort of breadth of experience. And I would also mention our incoming governor has really identified sort of executive management as being one of her top priorities. So that is a key thing. Second of all, someone who's committed to our mission at DEQ, which is protecting public health and the environment. But also somebody, I think, who understands the complex regulatory environment that we're in and can really sort of balance those two worlds. And then I would say, finally, someone who's committed to environmental justice and the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, we've really seen a change in our workforce and a very different level of expectation from our staff about the kind of leadership we exhibit in those areas. So those are some of the qualities that we hope to see. I don't know if you want me to talk now a little bit about just some of the things where I think one of our top of mind issues is the upcoming legislative session. We start that in January, and we have a number of bills that we're going to be hoping to pursue if we get approval from our incoming governor. We're in that sort of awkward phase where we're waiting to find out some things, but one key issue for us is our Title V program. We are going to be seeking a fee increase. We haven't done that for over 13 years and have some shoring up to do of that program. We're going to be looking at our e-cycles program. This is how we recycle electronics. We haven't updated that program since it started in 2007. We have a couple of groundwater-related bills, one related to establishing a task force so we can look at groundwater quality and sort of evaluate that, and one related to domestic well testing. We think we'll probably have some conversation with the legislature around our EV rebate program. I mentioned earlier, we're one of the top 5 states, I believe, around EV sales. So it's very, very popular, but we're running out of money. So we have to sort of figure out what's our long-term plan for that. We also just produced a report for the legislature on medium and heavy-duty electrification. It's on our website if you want to learn more about that and kind of our hopes and dreams around how we pursue that issue. And then I would say another issue we expect to be very hot in the Oregon legislature is around water issues generally, so both quality and quantity, water reuse being a huge topic. So we are planning to have a very, very busy 2023, just working on the legislative pieces, not to mention a lot of other things we're working on.
Sounds like a lot is going on, and I bet that's not just true for ODEQ. Anthony, what about EPA? What are you all looking forward to in 2023?
Well, we got a new WOTUS rule, interim rule, the definition of waters of the U.S. I expect any day now there's going to be a press release on that. If maybe it already went out today or even last night, I don't know. But you should look for that. Next summer, we'll finalize rules on 2 of the perfluorinated compounds that we put a proposal for designation as a hazardous substance out. That's PFOA and PFOS. I don't know how to say that, PFOS. I'm not going to try to say the chemical compound name, I know that. We've got tremendous water infrastructure projects going on. Like I said before, I mean, it's about our annual budget worth of extra money that we're funneling to small communities, to disadvantaged communities. I think the bill alone had $5.5 billion so far this year we put into that. So huge infrastructure projects, huge opportunities for communities, for those that provide those services. I think beyond that, there are, we just formed a new office out of some pre-existing components and some new components, the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, which provides a new elevated focus to those areas, that provides also some extra resources for conflict resolution, for coalition building or consensus building, and for making sure that those with disparate impacts from past practices and current practices are addressed fairly and appropriately. That we spend the money I just talked about in a fair way to help those where the greatest need is. Gosh, that's going to be a big focus going forward. Climate adaptation, we've talked about mitigation. I would say adaptation. I'm very focused on disaster resilience. Whether or not the climate was changing, we need to be resilient for disasters. And changing climate only emphasizes the need for that more. And I've been involved not only in the Western Oregon wildfires, but Laura mentioned the Northeast Washington floods that I've also been involved with a little bit in doing some work there. So yeah, we've just got I think not only those things we know about, but we're looking forward to uncertainty and trying to be as best prepared for that as we can.
Absolutely. Laura, how do Ecology's 2023 goals align with what you've heard so far, and what's different?
Well, I think aligned with a lot of what I've heard so far. One thing I'll mention in Washington State is focus on clean energy siting. Those of you who have done permitting work in Washington may be aware that we are not known for being the fastest, most streamlined state for being able to get permits through to build new projects. And we also often have pretty strong community opposition to just about anything that you might want to build in Washington, depending on where you want to build it. So it's been a big focus area for the governor to look at, we want to decarbonize the economy by 2050. That's huge. And in order to do that, you need to be able to build more clean manufacturing, you need to be able to build more clean energy facilities, and you need to be able to do it more quickly than we've managed to be able to do it to date. So big focus area for the governor. We completed with the Department of Commerce a siting report with recommendations to the legislature. We submitted that last week, and it's got recommendations in there like doing a programmatic EIS for certain types of facilities, doing least conflict mapping. Where are the areas of the state where we're going to see the least conflict in terms of trying to site projects? And I would not be surprised if there were legislative proposals coming out either through the report that we submitted and the recommendations, or maybe just some other ideas that legislators may have in mind. The other thing that I'll mention quickly is our own legislative priorities, really all around climate resilience and water. We'll have 3 proposals this session. If they get into the governor's budget, we'll have 3 proposals this session. One is a drought preparedness and recovery to basically bolster that account a little bit so that when we find ourselves in drought conditions, we will have money available to basically provide emergency drought funding to those parties that need that funding. We also have a bill around implementing the Walla Walla 2050 water plan. For those of you that work in Eastern Washington, Walla Walla has been an over-appropriated river system for over 100 years. There's a plan to basically look at water supply both for in-stream and out-of-stream uses, and this would be putting the tools together to help us implement that plan, working with Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla in partnership to accomplish that. And then third, we've got a climate resilience bill that would have the Department of Ecology updating our rather outdated climate resilience strategy and working with other agencies very closely to be able to do that.
Great, thanks, Laura. Dan, how is Idaho Department of Environmental Quality looking at 2023? Similar priorities to Oregon and Washington, different?
I think maybe a little bit different. We're really focusing on trying to work with the regulated community and be prepared to take advantage of the funding opportunities that are out there, and work with the growth that we're seeing to kind of invest wisely in protecting our water for the future. So a couple of the things that come with that, we just recently took over primacy of the NPDES program. So we've kind of been stepping that over the last 5 years. We now have primacy of all the permits, which means now we have to implement those permits, and now we have to write the new permits that are due. And so that's been a real challenge, I think, just keeping up with particularly where we have new facilities that want to open up and need a permit so they can discharge. It's been a real challenge. That's a challenge for us, and so looking ahead, that's something we're working on for 2023 is being able to work with industry where we need new permits to get those written in a way that meets the Clean Water Act, but also allows for the growth that we're seeing in the state. We also have just received results from the National Academy of Sciences review of water quality in Coeur d'Alene Lake. And so that's a new kind of to-do list for us. We have a list of 23 recommendations from the National Academy of Sciences for things that we can do to better understand things that we're doing with water quality, better understand how the lake functions. I'll do a plug for a panel we're having this afternoon to talk about that. So that's kind of an exciting project that we have coming up this year. And really the last thing is just working with a lot of our small communities. We provide a lot of really engineering assistance to those communities to manage their drinking water and wastewater systems. Most of these are communities that have a one part-time clerk and someone who drives the snowplow. So they don't have a lot of technical staff. So our staff really fill in and help them get in a position where they have all of their planning documents prepared so that they're able to apply for the ARPA funds and things like that. So we have a lot of emphasis on that because we see this as an opportunity to help them replace some of their aging infrastructure.
Great. Dan, you alluded to funding. I think this year we saw the passage of two very significant federal pieces of funding, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Anthony, I'd like to hear from EPA and Region 10 on what you're doing with this funding you talked about, this funding surplus. What should we expect to see with respect to these additional funds? Where will they be spent, and how will that affect the regulated community?
Did I do it again? Testing. There we go. It's kind of across much of the board of what EPA does. So everything from research and development to program implementation to pass-through funds for grants for communities. So we talk about our Superfund projects, for instance. A lot of those have been expedited. I think this first year of this extra funding, we somewhere around 44 to 49 sites, I can't remember, somewhere in that range that have had accelerated work, and I think 60% of those have a very significant environmental justice overlay. So, and that's in line with our EJ40 with the 40%, emphasis on environmental justice communities for how we spend our resources. So I mentioned earlier $1.5 billion over 5 years for brownfields assessments and cleanup grants. Let's see, so 5.5 so far this year for water infrastructure out of the 14 billion bill funds, and there's more coming of that. And then that's just this year. So next year, and next year, and next year, and next year will be more and more and more out of the 60 billion that EPA is receiving over 5 years out of bill. Then there's the American Rescue Plan. We're still spending some money that because it's multi-year money. And then you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a lot of emphasis on climate effects and climate change investments in clean energy and things that my colleagues have already mentioned. Gosh, I'm probably forgetting 83 different things, right? Because it's just huge. It's pretty soon we're going to be talking about real money. It's mind-boggling to me. I characterize it maybe unfairly the other day as kind of a drunken spending spree, but we're trying to be sober about it. And so, we don't get to choose the appropriations that we get from Congress. We're not a legislative body. We are an executive agency, just like the other folks here. So Laura said budget is policy, and so now our policy is to spend this money as as soberly and effectively and responsibly as we can.
I'd like to hear from the states about this drunken spending spree. Have you all seen any of this money yet, and what are you doing to ramp up in anticipation of some of this money? Dan, how about you, since you alluded to this earlier?
Yeah, so the biggest effort that we have undertaken so far is identifying the need for how are we going to distribute this funding. So we've primarily worked through our state revolving fund program to kind of gear up projects. And in a typical year, we would typically see on the clean water SRF between $70 and $250 million of projects identified kind of on a typical year over the last 10 years or so. This year we received just under $1 billion worth of letters of interest just for the clean water side. On the drinking water side, a typical year is between 19 and 50 million, and we received $392 million worth of ask. So part of the gearing up is kind of been coming up with a wish list with all the facilities, and you can't just have a wish list. You also have to have it has to be supported by a plan that says, here's what the need is, here's why we need it, here's what our population growth is going to be, and how we're going to upgrade our infrastructure. So again, kind of going back to that a lot of our facilities really don't have their own staff, so getting them the technical resources they have to evaluate what their capacity is now, what do you see it being, and so that's been so far the biggest effort is just kind of coming up with that. We did just issue our intended use plan for all of the ARPA dollars, so that's out on the streets, and we're able to do a lot of just straight grants for particularly some of our smaller communities where kind of based on the median income of those facilities. So that's been a big lift. We've also been working on kind of coming up with all of our plans for all the reporting that's going to be required for those dollars. So we've been doing a lot of work with our grants and contracts folks, and then working on getting staffed up so we have the people available to meet all those needs.
So it sounds like in 2023, next year when we're back on this stage, we'll be hearing about some of those impacts and the projects that have been implemented. So really exciting, and I think a lot to see, a lot in store. Nancy, were you?
I was just going to mention in Oregon, of course, we love a good drunken spending spree as well. I think we're really excited and interested in all the money that we know is going to be dedicated toward GHG reduction activities, and just some preliminary conversations happening among some of the natural resource agencies in Oregon about, how do we position ourselves to either receive dollars that coming to the agencies or help ensure dollars are going to local government or wherever they're best placed. We know there have been some conversations already around a green bank in Oregon. So we're I would say the early stages, haven't quite figured out yet how we're going to do this. I think another challenge for us just that we've seen with the ARPA dollars is as dollars come in, again, if we're then passing them through to other sort of sub-grantees, just having that infrastructure in our agencies to be able to effectively manage grants at a very different level than we've ever had to do. So I think that's kind of a new conversation actually we're having with the legislature, which is like, we need positions to help us do this. So I think we'll really be sort of, that'll be on steroids coming up here in 2023 and beyond.
Absolutely. I want to switch gears and touch on something I've heard many of you talk about, which is environmental justice. I think for many people, the racial justice protests of 2020 put a real spotlight on systemic racism and also led to a renewed commitment to environmental justice. And we've heard about this from many of the agencies. And we'll be focused on this at this conference, not only on environmental justice itself, but also specifically on how regulated businesses can see this renewed commitment from the agencies trickle down and impact business. So I'd like to hear from you all. What are your agencies doing with respect to environmental justice, and how should regulated businesses be preparing for some of the new legislation and programs that you've rolled out? Laura, will you start?
Yeah, happy to start. Is my microphone on? So we have, so I think you're absolutely right that 2020 created sort of national attention on all kinds of racial justice issues as well as environmental justice issues. So although Department of Ecology has had a focus on environmental justice for as long as I've worked with them, which was from 2003 through the present, the focus in 2020 really allowed us to bring many more resources into the agency to be able to do this kind of work. And so we had the Healthy Environment for All Act passed in 2021. That created an Environmental Justice Council that provides guidance to state agencies in how to carry out environmental justice obligations. And then beginning in summer of 2023, we'll start doing environmental justice assessments for major agency actions. And so that's going to be a new kind of hard look at the environmental justice impacts of decisions that we make at the Department of Ecology. And then we set up within our agency an Office of Equity and Environmental Justice. So we went from having one person who did environmental justice full-time and then a bunch of people that had a little smattering of environmental justice as part of their portfolio to having an office. And when we're fully staffed up, it'll be 8 or 9 people that will be focused on carrying out environmental justice considerations and equity considerations for the state. So what does that mean? It kind of sounds a little, fluffy. What does that mean on the ground? Well, I'll give an example. One of the things is we're taking a hard look at how we do supplemental environmental projects. That's when we settle a penalty, we bring money in. Sometimes rather than just put it into a state fund, the entity that we're settling with prefers to do a supplemental environmental project, and so that money's going directly out into a project in the community. And we're looking at helping to make sure that we're using those dollars in a way that best benefits and elevates those communities that have had disproportionate environmental impacts. We're also looking at that in terms of where we spend our environmental resources, or enforcement resources, compliance resources, and then we look at it in terms of the lens through which we're making budget requests to the governor's office or the legislature, the lens in which what are the legislative proposals that we're going to put forward? Are we putting forward proposals that are really aimed, at least in part, at diminishing the environmental impacts that certain communities have experienced in Washington State? When I say certain communities, it's communities of color, lower income communities for the most part, and a lot of rural communities. Everyone always thinks of those as being urban communities, but we have a lot of environmental justice communities in rural areas around the state as well.
Thanks, Laura. Nancy, you alluded to a focus on environmental justice being a component of the job description for the new director. I'd like to hear about what Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is doing in terms of environmental justice and what you see the new director's role being in that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think our story in Oregon is fairly similar to Washington. Maybe we're like a little bit further behind. This has been an important priority for the agency, but definitely more urgent in recent months and years. Earlier this year, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 4077, and it does two things. One is sort of reinvigorates our Environmental Justice Council and adds new membership, a youth member, for example. Also, really importantly, creates an EJ mapping tool. And this is going to be led by DEQ and Oregon Health Authority, but we're working closely with Oregon State University and Portland State and others on this. And we have sort of about a 2-year horizon to get this mapping tool developed. And we got some new resources from the legislature, which was great. That doesn't always happen when it comes to EJ work. So I'm actually hiring 2 staff that hopefully I'll have on board by the end of this year. But just, again, kind of the mapping tool being really important, I think, for us, because one, I think it will help us sort of identify and prioritize, where we want to put resources. And one thing that was interesting to me is sort of across state government, how much interest from other agencies there was in the development of having this tool. Like Department of Transportation would love to have an environmental justice mapping tool, and our Department of Land Conservation and others, really are all sort of looking to have this information. And I think also really want to engage very differently with communities, underserved communities. In the past, we've sort of, worked on our thing and come and said, here, we're done, what do you think? And that doesn't really work anymore. We have to engage up front. And so I think we see this process and tool as, really helping that. Internally at DEQ, you asked about our director, and this was a big priority for our former director, and I think really pushed our agency and really wanted to create that office. We weren't quite ready to do that, but we are hiring staff. We have an agency-wide environmental justice work group, and we're really focused on that community engagement. Thinking about, something that was a bit new for us, which is compensating people for their sort of sustained engagement with DEQ, because they're bringing in expertise to some of these conversations. So we're trying to figure out, how to do that. The other thing we're really focused on right now is Title VI compliance and looking at language access. And we have a language access plan in development. So I think, I'd love to report back a year from now, like kind of where we're at and how we've sort of grown and developed and have staff and sort of where we're at in the development of some of these projects and initiatives.
Good, deal. I'll take notes. We'll be back next year. So in preparing for this panel, I spoke to many of the regulated businesses I work with and some of the environmental consultants and asked them, what's on your mind? What are you concerned about? And something I heard over and over from many of you in the audience was PFAS, emerging contaminants generally, but specifically PFAS, and more specifically, the listing of PFAS as a hazardous substance under federal law, which Anthony, you discussed earlier, touched on earlier. I'd like to hear more about that. It's clear that EPA is acting on its PFAS action plan or strategic roadmap that it put in place a few years ago. Tell us, where do you expect to go with respect to PFAS and regulating PFAS?
So I'm certainly no expert in it, but my understanding of where we are today in our roadmap for PFAS is that we started didn't start, but continued the process in late August. We proposed the 2 compounds I mentioned as hazardous substances. And that means if that goes forward, which the comment period, if you had strong feelings about it, I hope you availed yourself of the opportunity for public comment, which ended, I think, November 7th. If that's finalized, and how it's finalized in the summer next year, will mean that we'll go from only providing sort of education and research and advisory and guidelines and things to having more tools in the toolbox for those particular compounds, including the ability to investigate and respond to or to enforce on actions that involve those compounds. So that means we're in the Superfund in the RCRA realm after that is finalized. So beyond that, I know that there are other compounds in that umbrella that are being looked at. And I think that we've seen this wide-ranging tapestry. I think there are over half of the states, or maybe it's 24, somewhere around half or more of the states have various screening levels or maximum contaminant levels for drinking water for PFAS compounds. And I'm hoping, and we talked briefly this morning about regulator, meet the regulators, and the term regulator means someone who's involved in making something regular, predictable, understandable, being able to anticipate what the rules are so that we can all play by the same rules. And so I'm hoping that part of that roadmap will get us to a consistent basis upon which the country can operate. And that means for states, they can, of course, do that and more if they feel it's necessary for their constituencies.
Thanks, Anthony. PFAS aren't the only emerging contaminant, obviously. I think in 2020, in the height of the pandemic, I remember clicking on CNN and seeing that a study had been completed in Washington related to 6-PPD, and the University of Washington and Washington State University had come up with some fairly significant findings regarding salmon spawning and the impacts of 6-PPD. Seeing that on the national news and on CNN was pretty surprising. Laura, can you talk a bit about that study and how the Department of Ecology has been reacting?
Yeah, would love to talk about 6-PPD quinone. And I don't know if everyone in the room has heard, everyone in the room has certainly heard of PFAS. Maybe everyone in the room has heard of 6-PPD quinone. It's starting to get more national attention, in particular in the Great Lakes area, but it really is something that just initially got attention just in Washington State, because salmon returning to spawn in Puget Sound creeks, coho salmon in particular, there was mortality syndrome. I mean, there was something that was causing instant, near instant death to returning salmon, and so that was a big problem and something that we have been aware of for a couple of decades, but didn't find out until late 2020 when the University of Washington Stormwater Center completed its research, that it actually came down to one chemical. It's 6-PPD quinone, which is 6-PPD, which is something that's put in tires to keep them from breaking down. It's a safety component. It contributes to the longevity of the tire, but when it was mixing with ozone, it was creating 6-PPD quinone, and that was the one chemical that was causing these salmon mortality events, which is actually pretty amazing, right? Because I think University of Washington went into it thinking we're going to find a cocktail of chemicals, and then what are we going to do? We're going to have to look at all kinds of different solutions, and it's not that it's easy to fix, because this is a necessary component of tires. We don't want our tires to break down when we're driving in our vehicles, but being able to isolate it to one chemical means that it allows us to look for alternatives to that chemical that will perform the same safety functions in tires and get 6-PPD out of tires and get it out of the and get it out of stormwater so that it doesn't enter our streams. And then after it was discovered that this was the issue in Washington State, we're finding, of course, that it's an issue for other fish species in other parts of the nation. So since this was discovered, legislatures really galvanized to action, governors really galvanized to action. We got $700,000 from the legislature last year to do a couple of different things. One is to look at what are the best stormwater solutions for getting 6-PPD, filtering it out of stormwater so that it's not entering the water system, after it's being released through tires. But the other thing, of course, is to look at alternatives so that eventually we're able to phase this chemical out and again replace it not with a regrettable substitute, but a substitute that performs the same functions but doesn't have the negative environmental impacts. And we've been working obviously with the tire industry on that. And so those are really kind of the two focus areas, and have been able to make some progress. We've identified 9 potential alternative chemicals. Of course, need to look at those to see whether they are safe alternatives, and so we'll be looking for more funding to be able to take that study to the next step. And then the stormwater studies, we have learned that a lot of existing stormwater infrastructure is actually pretty effective at filtering out 6-ppd quinone. So that's great. We recently released our updated draft municipal stormwater permits, and they've got some more provisions in there around protecting against 6-ppd quinone. So it's going to continue to be a real focus area. And then because it's getting national attention, so excited to have EPA paying attention to the issue. They recently formed a national work group to look at 6-ppd quinone under EPA's national laws, and we really, really value having EPA's input in this. So far, it's really been Washington and California that have been most focused on it. But again, I think as it gets more of a national profile, we're going to see more and more states picking up an interest in it.
Absolutely. This is the Business and Environment Conference, so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you all, how are your respective agencies supporting businesses, the regulated community in the region? I'd like to hear about what you're doing, how you're thinking about supporting business, and how you're trying to work closely with the regulated community to ensure that regulated business thrives in your state. Nancy, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, I think this has been sort of an interesting tension point at times for us at DEQ in Oregon. I was thinking back, before I started at DEQ, about 6 years ago, we had a real crisis around bullseye glass, and there was I think a real criticism of the agency for not being more proactive around public health and finding toxics near schools and playgrounds and daycares. And so I think the agency has had a sharper focus around public health and that environmental protection, but at the same time, I think, sort of that recognition that we also have to do our part, though, as that regulator and be kind of that good partner, I think, to the regulated community, and make sure that we're also, issuing permits in a timely fashion, that we have good communication, that we have good procedures in place and guidance and all of the pieces. So we've been really working on that. It's definitely a work in progress, I would say. Just recently, I observed that we were working on a rulemaking in our air quality division, and we were getting a lot of feedback, some pretty negative feedback at times from some of our regulated partners about the scope of this rulemaking. And we really did take that to heart, and we also had a lot of conversations internally about our ability to actually implement some of these rule changes. And we made some very significant changes to this rulemaking in response to that feedback, and recognize that we sort of need to phase this in, and we need to have a lot of conversation, not just about sort of what's the impact externally, but what's the impact internally. Can we do this? Are we ready to implement these rules in a timely way? And so I think we're really grappling with those issues right now at DEQ, just again, trying to find that balance. So we have a lot of external community organizations that really want to see us take a hard line on certain protections, and we want to be very protective of the public health, but again, want to find that balance a little bit. So I think that's going to be a theme for us again when our new director is going to be sort of in the thick of all of that, I think, in the coming year. So.
That makes complete sense. Dan, want to hear from you and Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. As you discussed, Idaho's growing, one of the fastest growing states in the nation, and Boise, I think, is the first or second fastest growing city, welcoming a lot of business to the state. How are you all working with regulated entities, especially given the staffing shortages and the huge influx of people to your state?
Yeah, so Idaho really prides itself in being very business friendly, so that's everything that we do at DEQ kind of has that lens of being business friendly and working with the regulated community very collaboratively. So most of our requirements are just state primacy of federal requirements. So we don't have a whole lot of extra things on top of what's already required under federal law. And so the value that we add at DEQ is being in Idaho on the ground, where the regulated community can come walk into the office and come talk to our staff about, hey, what do we have to do if we want to build this facility? Or if, we're working on this new permit, we want to make this change. We're very accessible. I think that's, we get feedback that doing business in Idaho is at times different than other states, in part because our people are so accessible. You literally can walk in the door and talk to almost anyone in the office, and they'll hear you out on what your question is. And we pride ourselves in helping businesses in Idaho operate in a way that makes them meet the federal requirements. So the alternative is you get to deal with EPA in Seattle and their big stick if you don't follow their rules. We're here to help you make sure that you've checked all the boxes so that you're protected from that.
Any response, Anthony?
Absolutely. I very much believe exactly in what Dan just said. He said that we want to follow the rules, we want to do it right, we want to do it in a way that's fostering success for those businesses that follow the rules. So, my agency and some others are a backstop to when folks don't follow the rules, and that's a big part of why we're here. We do deliver some of our regulations more directly, like the oil spill prevention regulations. And I think that, and I promote with my staff and others at our agency, that we also ought to have an open door policy. And if you want to know my cell phone number, see me after this session, I'll give it to you. Call me anytime. We should be like that. We should be, able to communicate. I'm not suggesting everybody up here needs to give you their cell phone number, but the idea that we're somehow behind a big curtain and you can't see the machinations of what goes on is not in anybody's interest. We need to be transparent. We need to be available and accessible, and not just to the general public, but to those that are trying to foster successful economies that our general public depends on.
We have about just a few minutes left. So with the last few minutes, I'd like to hear from you all. What should this audience know about working with your agency? Let's do quick round, speed round, 30 seconds or less, starting with Laura.
Yeah, so I will just kind of pick up on where the conversation just left off, and that is, what folks should know in working with the agency is that we also try to be helpful to business, be accessible to business, answer questions. And in particular, when we've got a compliance or enforcement action, we're looking really hard at who's the company, what's the entity that engaged in that? Is it a small business? Is it a company where maybe the owners are not native English speakers? You look at a number of factors and make sure that we are providing as much technical assistance in the field as we need to provide until it gets to the level of active enforcement. We'd much rather work with companies and get compliance than end up in an enforcement situation. So we're always very willing to work with companies, and I hope that you find us accessible. And if you don't, by all means, people do know how to get in touch with me as well. And I will tell you, I do get a trickling of emails every month of someone saying, "Hey, nobody responded to me in this program." Usually it's because the person's on vacation or something. But we make sure that we're being responsive and communicative.
Dan, what should these folks know about IDEQ?
Well, I think at Idaho DEQ, we really pride ourselves in working with people and helping people meet requirements to protect Idaho's air, land, and water. So, it's a good place to do business. We're happy to help people. We work with our communities really closely. And it's a great place to live.
Nancy.
Well, yes, we also, of course, want to be very accessible. We are listening for anybody who feels like we're not. We really do listen, and we do take your comments to heart. I would also say just kind of a theme for us is really implementation coming up. We have a lot on our plate, and a lot of people keep approaching us and wanting us to oversee something new, and I'm constantly saying, no more. We got to do what we already have on our plate. So I think we want to get really, really good at what we're doing and really, follow through on all the responsibilities that we already have.
Great. Well, thanks all of you for your time today, and thanks to the agencies for making themselves available throughout this conference. There are lots of representatives from each of these agencies here, and they're here to mingle and discuss these issues and delve in deeper. So thank you all for your time. Thanks to everyone in the audience for getting here early, being part of the discussion, and have a wonderful conference. Thank you.